Normandy, August 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. A German observation post overlooking a strategic crossroads, manned by 4 sentries rotating shifts through the darkness. Gefreiter Hans Müller stood his watch, scanning the hedgerows with practiced eyes. He'd survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. He knew how to stay alert, how to spot movement, how to stay alive. At 0247 hours, his partner, stationed 30 meters away, simply stopped responding to check-in calls. Müller assumed he'd fallen asleep, a court-martial offense, but understandable after 18-hour shifts. He decided to investigate, walking quietly toward his comrade's position. He found him slumped against the sandbags, dead. A single bullet wound through the temple, still warm. Müller's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard a shot, nothing, not a rifle crack, not a suppressed pistol, not even a distant echo, just silence and death, and a dead soldier who'd been alive 60 seconds ago. He grabbed his radio, started to call it in, and that's when the second sentry died. Müller heard the impact, a wet thunk of bullet hitting flesh, but no gunshot. He spun toward the sound, raising his weapon, scanning the darkness desperately. The third sentry died before Müller could finish turning. Another impact, another body falling. Still no sound of gunfire. Just the night and the wind, and somewhere in that darkness, something that killed without noise. Müller ran. His officers thought he'd gone mad, shell shock, battle fatigue. They sedated him, prepared to court-martial him for desertion. Then the reports started coming in. Across the Normandy front, German sentries were dying in silence. No gunshots heard, no muzzle flashes seen. Just dead soldiers with bullet wounds and terrified survivors babbling about invisible killers who struck from the darkness without sound. The weapon responsible was the De Lisle Carbine, and it was the quietest rifle ever used in combat. Quieter than anything the Germans had, quieter than modern suppressed weapons. So quiet that you could fire it in one room while someone stood in the next and hear nothing but a metallic click. This is the story of the rifle that turned night into a hunting ground and German sentries into prey. Let's go back to 1942. Britain's Commandos and Special Operations units were conducting night raids across occupied Europe, hitting coastal installations, gathering intelligence, eliminating high-value targets. These operations required stealth above all else. Get in silently, complete the mission, get out before the Germans knew you were there. The problem was noise, specifically gunfire noise. Even the best suppressed weapons of the era, including the well-rod pistol, had limitations. The well-rod was silent, yes, but it was single shot, bolt action, and limited to pistol caliber ammunition. At ranges beyond 20 meters, accuracy became guesswork. For a commando who needed to eliminate a sentry at 50 or 75 meters, beyond grenade range, beyond knife range, but still close enough to raise an alarm if you missed, the well rod wasn't enough. What the British needed was a rifle. A proper rifle with rifle caliber accuracy and range, capable of reliably killing at distance. But it had to be as quiet as the well rod. No loud suppressed crack like conventional suppressed rifles. No subsonic 9mm that dropped like a stone beyond 50 meters. They needed full rifle performance in near total silence. This seemed impossible. The loudest part of a gunshot isn't the explosion of gunpowder. It's the sonic boom of the bullet breaking the sound barrier. Suppress the powder explosion all you want, but if your bullet is supersonic, it'll still crack like a whip as it flies. The only solution was subsonic ammunition, but subsonic rifle rounds didn't exist in any practical form. Slow a rifle bullet down to subsonic speeds, and you lost the velocity and energy that made rifles superior to pistols. Enter William Godfrey De Lisle, a British engineer and firearms designer working with the Ministry of Supply. In 1942, De Lisle had a radical idea. Instead of trying to make rifle ammunition subsonic, why not use pistol ammunition in a rifle? .45 ACP, the heavy, slow bullet from the American 1911 pistol. It was already subsonic. It was already common in Allied arsenals, and if you fired it from a rifle-length barrel with proper rifling, you could achieve carbine-level accuracy at ranges a pistol could never match. But the genius wasn't just the ammunition choice. It was what De Lisle did with the suppressor. The De Lisle Carbine looked like no other weapon of World War II. At first glance, it resembled a Lee-Enfield rifle because it was built on a modified Lee-Enfield action, the bolt-action system British soldiers had carried since 1895. But the barrel and suppressor assembly were completely custom, and they were what made the weapon extraordinary. The barrel measured just under 9 inches, short for a rifle but necessary for the design. 45 ACP ammunition with deep rifling cut specifically for the heavy, slow bullet. But here's where De Lisle's brilliance showed. The barrel was ported along its length with a series of precisely drilled holes. These ports bled off propellant gases into the surrounding suppressor chamber before they could exit the muzzle. This was critical because in conventional suppressors, all the gas exits at the muzzle and has to be contained and baffled there. De Lisle's design distributed gas management along the entire length of the barrel, dramatically reducing pressure at the exit point. The suppressor itself enclosed the entire barrel and extended several inches beyond it. Inside this tube sat a complex series of baffles, metal discs with precisely angled cuts that forced expanding gases through a tortuous path, slowing them, cooling them, dispersing their energy. The baffles were made from steel, not rubber like the Welrod's wipes, meaning they didn't degrade with use. The overall length of the weapon was just over 33 inches, compact enough for close-quarters work, long enough for stable aiming. The stock came from a modified Lee-Enfield, providing familiar ergonomics for British soldiers. 45 ACP feeding through a custom-designed magazine system adapted from the Thompson submachine gun. And the result of all this engineering? A weapon that produced approximately 85 decibels when fired, about as loud as a car door closing, quieter than normal conversation, quieter than the bow cycling. You won't believe what happened when British commandos first test-fired this weapon and realized they could hold normal conversations while shooting. To understand how revolutionary the De Lisle was, you need to understand why guns are loud. When gunpowder ignites, it creates expanding gas at extreme pressure and temperature. This gas propels the billet, but also wants to escape. When it finally does escape at the muzzle, it exits faster than the speed of sound, creating a massive pressure wave, a sonic boom, that we hear as a gunshot. 303 British rifle, the Lee-Enfield, produced about 155 to 160 decibels. That's louder than a jet engine. Even suppressed rifles of the era still produced 120 to 130 decibels, quieter but still unmistakably gunfire. 45 ACP round traveled at roughly 850 feet per second, well below the 1,125 FPS speed of sound. No supersonic crack, no sonic boom, just the bullet moving through air at subsonic speeds which produced almost no sound. As the bullet traveled down the barrel, propellant gases bled through the ports into the suppressor chamber. This happened gradually along the barrel's length, preventing a single massive pressure spike at the muzzle. By the time the bullet exited, most of the gas had already been dispersed and baffled. The suppressor baffles weren't just random obstacles, they were precisely calculated to create turbulence in the gas flow, breaking up pressure waves and converting kinetic energy into heat. The gases exited the suppressor cool, slow, and quiet. But here's what made the De Lisle truly special. Most suppressed weapons grew louder with each shot as components heated up and degraded. The De Lisle maintained consistent sound levels because its steel baffles didn't wear out, and its ported barrel design distributed heat along the entire length rather than concentrating it at the muzzle. Field tests produced results that seemed impossible. At 50 meters, a De Lisle firing produced less noise than the target's body hitting the ground. At 100 meters, the sound was indistinguishable from ambient night sounds, wind, rustling leaves, distant vehicle traffic. One test report from 1943 described a demonstration where a De Lisle was fired in one room of a building while German POWs, brought in to provide authentic enemy perspective, sat in the next room with the door open. They heard nothing. When shown the bullet-riddled target afterward, they refused to believe the weapon had been fired while they were present. The Germans had nothing that came close. Nothing. The De Lisle never entered mass production. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 130 units were manufactured. Some sources suggest as many as 200, but records are incomplete. These were hand-built at Sterling Armaments Company facilities, each weapon individually fitted and tested. Why so few? Because the De Lisle was never intended as a standard-issue weapon. It was a specialist tool for specific units conducting specific missions: commandos, SOE operatives, SAS patrols, special boat service raiders, the men who fought in darkness and silence, who needed to eliminate sentries without raising alarms. Each weapon came with a leather carrying case, cleaning kit, and several magazines. Some units received small quantities of tracer rounds, yes, suppressed tracers existed, for marking targets during night operations, though these were rarely used since the visible tracer defeated the weapon's stealth purpose. The British issued De Lisles to commando units preparing for D-Day operations. Small teams would land ahead of the main invasion force, tasked with eliminating German observation posts and coastal sentries silently. A De Lisle in the hands of a skilled marksman could clear an entire sentry line, 4, 5, 6 soldiers, before anyone realized they were under attack. The weapon also went to SOE agents operating in occupied Europe. Unlike the well rod, which was for close-range assassination, the De Lisle was for tactical elimination, killing guards during sabotage operations, eliminating sentries before raids, silencing dogs that might alert German patrols. And, critically, De Lisles were issued to resistance training teams. British instructors working with French Maquis and Norwegian resistance groups used them to train fighters in marksmanship and sentry elimination. The weapon's near silence made training possible even in areas with German patrols nearby. But having a silent rifle was only half the equation. The men who carried it had to learn to use it in conditions where one mistake meant death. Commando training schools in Scotland, particularly at Auchnacarry, the legendary facility where British Special Forces trained, included dedicated courses for De Lisle operations. These weren't standard marksmanship courses. This was training for a completely different style of combat. First, trainees had to unlearn standard shooting doctrine. .45 ACP round had significantly more drop than standard rifle ammunition, .303 round. At 100 meters, the drop was dramatic. Commandos had to learn to compensate, aiming higher than they would with conventional rifles. Second, they trained in darkness, not twilight or moonlight, total darkness, because that's when the De Lisle was used. Instructors would set up dummy sentries and night exercises, and trainees would stalk through forests and hills trying to eliminate targets without being spotted. The De Lisle's silence meant that even if you missed your first shot, you might get a second before the target realized he was under fire, but only if you were fast. Third, trainees learned to work in pairs. One man with the De Lisle, one man spotting and providing backup with a silenced Sten or well rod pistol. The De Lisle shooter took the long-range targets. The backup handled any unexpected close-quarters encounters. Communication between the pair had to be silent, hand signals, practiced movements, absolute coordination. Fourth, and this was psychological training as much as technical, they learned to kill without hesitation. Sentry elimination wasn't combat in the traditional sense, it was execution. You aimed at a man who didn't know you were there, who might be smoking a cigarette or writing a letter home, and you put a bullet through his head. Some trainees struggled with this. Those who couldn't overcome the psychological barrier were reassigned. The final test was brutal, a nighttime live-fire exercise where trainees had to infiltrate a mock German position, eliminate multiple sentries, mannequins with realistic uniforms and equipment, and withdraw without being detected by instructors playing the role of roving patrols. Failure meant repeating the course. Success meant you got a De Lisle and a mission. June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. Small commando teams landed along the Normandy coast ahead of the main invasion. Their mission? Eliminate German observation posts that could call in artillery on the beaches at dawn. One team, part of the Special Air Service, infiltrated a German position near Pointe du Hoc. 4 sentries, rotating watches, covering a machine gun nest and radio station. The team's designated marksman carried a De Lisle. He approached within 70 meters, close enough for reliable accuracy, far enough to avoid detection. The first sentry died without knowing he was under attack. The bullet struck just behind the ear. He collapsed silently. 30 seconds later, the second sentry turned to check on his comrade and took a round through the throat. He gurgled, tried to scream, but died before he could raise an alarm. The third and fourth sentries heard something, not gunshots, but the sound of bodies falling. They turned, confused, scanning the darkness. The marksman fired twice in quick succession. Both went down. The entire position eliminated in under 2 minutes, with no alarm raised, no shots heard by German units further inland. The team destroyed the radio, sabotaged the machine gun, and withdrew. Then German reinforcements arrived at dawn. They found 4 dead sentries and no indication of how they died. This pattern repeated across the Normandy front. German sentries died silently. Observation posts went dark. Patrol leaders returned to find their rear guards dead. And the survivors, those who'd been just out of sight when their comrades died, told stories of ghost rifles and invisible killers. In one documented case, a German unit set up an ambush for the silent snipers, positioning 30 soldiers around the suspected infiltration route. A 2-man British team with a De Lisle identified the ambush, eliminated the 6 sentries on the perimeter one by one, and withdrew before the main German force even realized they were under attack. The De Lisle saw use throughout the European theater and beyond. In Italy, SAS patrols used them during mountain operations, eliminating German sentries in alpine positions where a normal rifle shot would echo for kilometers. The weapon's silence was perfect for the terrain. Kill a guard at one position, and the next position 200 meters away heard nothing. In Greece and Yugoslavia, SOE teams working with partisan forces used De Lisles to eliminate sentries guarding German supply depots and railways. The weapon's reliability in harsh conditions, mud, rain, dust, made it ideal for guerrilla operations where maintenance was difficult. There are reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of De Lisles being used in the Far East against Japanese forces. The weapon's effectiveness at eliminating sentries would have been valuable in jungle warfare, where noise discipline was critical and where a gunshot could alert enemy forces concealed in dense vegetation. But the De Lisle's greatest impact wasn't just the kills it achieved, it was the psychological effect on German forces. By mid-1944, German units in France were rotating sentries every 30 minutes instead of every 2 hours. They doubled and tripled sentry positions. They forbade sentries from standing in predictable locations or patterns. They issued standing orders that any unexplained death of a sentry meant the entire unit went on high alert. All of this degraded German effectiveness. Exhausted soldiers rotated too frequently to maintain alertness. Overcrowded sentry positions created confusion. Constant high alert status bred fatigue and false alarms. The De Lisle, by killing perhaps a few hundred German soldiers in total, forced changes in German doctrine that degraded the performance of hundreds of thousands. And the Germans never developed an effective counter. They tried night vision equipment, primitive infrared scopes that were heavy, fragile, and rarely worked. They tried sound detection equipment designed to locate artillery, but it couldn't pinpoint a weapon as quiet as the De Lisle. They tried training their own snipers to hunt the ghost riflemen, but British commandos operated at night when German snipers were effectively blind. The Germans were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't counter, and it terrified them. German documents from 1944 to 45 reveal the extent of their confusion and fear. Intelligence reports described British or American weapons capable of firing without audible report, which analysts initially dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. .45 caliber weapons that shouldn't be silent. The reality became undeniable. Some German units issued standing orders prohibiting nighttime patrols in certain areas, effectively ceding control of the darkness to Allied forces. Other units built elaborate bunker systems for sentries, reasoning that concealment might protect them from invisible snipers. This reduced their fields of view and made them less effective. One Gefreiter's diary, recovered near Caen, describes the terror. "We stand watch, knowing that at any moment we might die without warning. No gunshot, no muzzle flash, just death from the darkness. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see or hear?" Another document, a Gestapo report investigating partisan activity in France, theorized that the British had developed electric rifles that fired bullets using electromagnetic force instead of gunpowder, which would explain the absence of noise. This wasn't just wrong, it showed how far beyond German understanding the De Lisle's performance was. Perhaps most telling, in March 1945, German intelligence offered a substantial reward for any De Lisles captured intact, along with instructions on how to recognize the weapon. They desperately wanted to understand the technology. But British commandos were under strict orders to destroy their De Lisles rather than risk capture, and they did. Not a single De Lisle was captured by German forces during the war. The Germans faced an invisible enemy armed with an impossible weapon, and they never solved the problem. The De Lisle wasn't perfect. Despite its revolutionary silence, it had significant limitations that prevented it from becoming a widespread weapon. First, ammunition. 45 ACP rounds, while accurate in a rifle barrel, still had limited range compared to standard rifle cartridges. Effective range was about 200 meters maximum, and practical combat range was closer to 100 meters. Beyond that, the heavy, slow bullet dropped precipitously and lost energy. Second, magazine capacity. 7 rounds wasn't much, especially for a weapon often used to eliminate multiple sentries. Reloading required removing an empty magazine and inserting a fresh one, a process that took several seconds and required movement that could give away your position. Third, the weapon was heavy. At just over 7 pounds, it weighed more than a standard submachine gun and wasn't much lighter than a full-size rifle. For commandos who needed to move fast and carry other equipment, this was a significant burden. Fourth, maintenance. The De Lisle suppressor didn't degrade like the Welrod's rubber wipes, but it did accumulate carbon fouling that reduced effectiveness over time. Cleaning required partial disassembly and careful maintenance, not always possible in field conditions. And fifth, cold weather could be problematic. 45 ACP ammunition sometimes failed to cycle reliably through the bolt action. This was less of an issue than with semi-automatic weapons, but it still caused occasional malfunctions during winter operations. But despite these limitations, every commando unit that received De Lisle's requested more. The weapon's tactical value far outweighed its drawbacks. After the war, most De Lisle carbines were destroyed or locked away in classified storage. The British government considered the weapon too specialized and too advanced to risk proliferating. A few survived in museums. The Imperial War Museum has one on display, and the Royal Armories at Leeds hold several in their collection. The design influenced post-war suppressed weapon development, 45 ACP chambering. In the 1960s, American Special Forces in Vietnam requested information about the De Lisle, hoping to develop similar weapons for tunnel warfare and sentry elimination. Some experimental weapons resulted from this research, though details remain classified. Modern suppressor manufacturers still cite the De Lisle as the benchmark for extreme sound suppression. While contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques have produced equally quiet weapons, none have significantly exceeded the De Lisle's performance, a remarkable testament to William De Lisle's engineering genius in 1942. The weapon remained classified until the 1970s. Veterans who'd used it couldn't discuss it for decades. Families learned about their fathers' and grandfathers' missions only through declassified documents released long after the operators had died. But among those who knew, Special Forces veterans, weapons historians, and intelligence professionals, the De Lisle occupies a unique place. It represents the absolute pinnacle of one specific capability: rifle range lethality in near total silence. Nothing before it matched its performance, and in 70 years since, nothing has truly exceeded it. The De Lisle Carbine never became famous. It never appeared in recruiting posters or victory parades. Most historians skip over it, focusing on the Sten, the Bren, the Lee Enfield, weapons that armed millions. The De Lisle armed perhaps a few hundred men for a few critical years in a few specialized roles. But those few hundred men, armed with that quiet rifle, achieved something remarkable. They made the darkness itself a weapon. They turned night from a time of relative safety for German forces into a hunting ground, where sentries died without warning and survivors told stories of invisible killers. They didn't win the war, no single weapon does, but they changed it. They forced German tactical doctrine to adapt. They degraded enemy effectiveness through fear and exhaustion. They proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the loudest or the deadliest. It's the one your enemy doesn't understand and can't counter. William De Lisle created something extraordinary, a weapon that made a rifle as quiet as a pistol without sacrificing rifle performance. For special operations forces fighting in darkness, that combination was transformative. The German sentries who died to De Lisle carbines never knew what killed them. One moment, standing watch. The next, nothing. No warning, no sound, just the darkness and then death. And perhaps that's the most terrifying weapon of all. Not the one that announces itself with thunder and fire, but the one that kills in silence, leaving survivors to wonder, will I be next? Is someone out there now aiming at me? Will I even hear the shot before I die? The De Lisle turned those questions into German nightmares, and nightmares in war can be as powerful as bullets. From silent rifles in the darkness to weapons hidden in plain sight, Britain's arsenal of unconventional warfare never stops surprising. Stay tuned to WW2 Weapons for more stories of the secret weapons that changed history. Subscribe now, because the next weapon might be even deadlier than you imagine. From silent rifles in the darkness to weapons hidden in plain sight, Britain's arsenal of unconventional warfare never stops surprising. Stay tuned to WW2 Weapons for more stories of the secret weapons that changed history. Subscribe now, because the next weapon might be even deadlier than you imagine.